dangers on the dark web are very clear for us to all observe. Often what we often think is that we might be protected sitting behind our tall browsers and we might be fully anonymous, but when you're dealing with government agencies, that can't be the case. So you shouldn't be worrying about that if you're doing research or you're browsing on your web, because if persons are involved in criminal activity, well then unfortunately they are then breaking the rule of law, and that's what tends to happen. So it's actually a good thing that government agencies might be observing you on the dark web, because that's not really a place you want to go. You can find all the information you need to find to conduct a normal, morally uncorruptible life on the clear web. And if you're in the dark web for research purposes, or normally you're assisting either government agency or you're supporting the police services and hunting down and tracking bad, or either doing researching to make people available. The other factor is that there are a lot of bad actors down there, and there's a lot of malicious applications that are weaponized that potentially can infect your systems. That's one needs to take account of. There's also obviously the damage to the psychological state, because there might be a title that says A, but you normally click on it, you end up with a potential image or some other kind of content that is not very savory. And unfortunately, a lot of the material out there is very graphic. And one needs to be aware of that, because it can affect you potentially psychologically. It's not something you want to see, and it's not, once you've seen it, you can't always unsee something that you don't want to see. And then of course there's malware and ransomware everywhere, which, as I mentioned, is weaponized. It's easy to weaponize an image or a link. It's a lot easier than most people think, because they normally just assume that it's safe to click around. But just a simple click can get your system infected, and you might not even know it. It's not in the days in the past where, oh, your machine's been hacked with a big highlighted flashing board or some imagery, and it doesn't happen like that. It's very quiet, as I mentioned, and it sits in the background and extracts your personal information. That's not what we want.
Yeah, and just to jump in there as well, we don't want to say that using a Tor browser is illegal by any means. Having that extra layer of anonymity when you're going out there to search for things is encouraged. We encourage you to use a Tor browser. It's a safe way of doing your research and browsing the internet. However, the Tor browser is that entry point to the dark web, and you don't want to be going down any rabbit holes that you shouldn't be. I think the danger that Carey touched on there was, you could be on the dark web for a valid reason, maybe conducting some research that you couldn't find out on the surface web. However, clicking a legitimate looking link that's talking about one topic could take you to somewhere completely different that you weren't expecting. And if there is an image there somewhere on the site, or even in the background that you can't see, which could be child pornography or drug related or assassination related, that is then cached onto your machine. And if you're caught with that in your possession, you've already committed a crime, which you didn't first, go out there to commit. So you do need to be very careful. Obviously, neither of us would recommend you using the dark web at all, but this presentation is here to show you what the dangers are, and how best to mitigate those. In the next slide, Carey's going to talk about some of those weaponized approaches. Talking right about the example I just spoke about there, where you go onto a site which you think is legitimate and, unaware that there's something in the background that could do a lot of damage to your machine.
But yeah, this is often, the criminals are very clever nowadays, and it's very easy to show you one thing, and then in the background something else is happening. Here's an example of a typical Google search, which most people would do once they have an idea of what's going on. If they'd like to get to the dark web, how am I going to get there? So I go to Google, and as we all do, we go and type in how to access the dark web. And there's a very good example of a smiley face with a little guy there and smiling away, and you wouldn't think twice, but you'd click on it, and that potentially could compromise your system, could infect your system. And if I didn't have some software identifying protecting my browser, then I potentially could have become a victim, and my system could end up being compromised. So it's advisable normally just to steer away from that, because there's normally sort of a macabre, darker side of the human psyche, when it comes to dealing with the dark web. There's very real specific purposes of going there. It's normally just research, and I don't want to reiterate what has been said already, but it's one thing to be cognitive. Just be careful. There are things out there. Make sure you have endpoint protection, but we'll discuss that in 1 or 2 slides going ahead. That what you think is very legitimate is often not.